Next, I would like to introduce about this social system. The previous slide it showed how utility level is affecting people's incentive, and then because of this, uh, one is making a decision to move from one location to another location. However, this utility idea is slightly difficult to understand, and so and also that it's not really relatable for architects and urban designers. So I would like to introduce this new concept or new way of thinking about the social system, which is represented through this diagram. So this social system diagram is a bit like a simulation. So you need to imagine that there is a certain area that is for observation, and then the system, or let's say that the simulation, starts once someone enters into this framework, and then one by one it goes through this social system parameters, and then it will start running. So each one is having its own kind of simulation. The total, of course, it's about the whole entire like region or neighborhood within the frame. But what I want to express here is that each one person will go through a certain flow, and then the decision has been made through the flow, and then therefore as a result you have an increase in population or you have a decrease in the population. So the idea behind it is that you need to imagine that if there are 100 population, there will be 100 times of this running. Okay. So to explain about this, those of you who doesn't know how to read system flow diagram, the diamond shape like this, it means it's a question. So you question, and then it will have an answer yes or no. So it splits into two branches. The one that is on the square one is an action that has been taken. Those circle ones, they will jump to another kind of system or another kind of rule. So in this case, it will jump to A dash. So it will, from here it jumps to this one. Like for example, this one, the moment it reaches to this B, then it will jump to the B flow. So this is the way to see the diagram. And then I will explain the components. There are 5 components in this flow chart. The first one is, actually the first one and the second one is A and A dash. It's about the framework, it's about the frame. And then it's also about the occupation. How do you settle inside that frame? And then the B, flow B, is about resources. Flow C is about the impact of what has been happening here. And then the D is exit. So what I said previously about how within the frame, when something enters inside, then there's an increase in the population, and then there could be a decrease in the population. It means that if one person successfully enters into the system, then the counter increases by 1. And then when it reaches to this exit, and then it exits from the flow, then it means there is a minus in terms of population, something like this. So one by one, I will explain the components. First one, about the frame. The frame is simply to set the target area for observation. So if you say you want to observe the whole entire world, then your frame is about the world itself. However, you might like to see a certain location. So perhaps it can be a region, it can be a country, or it can be a city. And so it's depending on what kind of frame you are working on, it kind of gives a different result. So once you set the frame, then you will start observing that specific area, and then you will see how much of agglomeration that is happening, which is based on the population increase. So in terms of the detail of these flow charts, it shows that it's about accessibility, and then course, I mean that the question first is about the accessibility. What does it mean by this? Is that within, okay, let's say you set yourself a frame like this, and so the frame is here. What does it mean by accessibility? Is that there is an agent somewhere here, and then that person wants to enter into this frame, within this frame. So there is a yes and no, meaning that is this a frame that one can access or not? So this is the first question. And then if it's not accessible, of course, it will go to the exit. So what are the consequences that makes people not able to enter into such a frame? So it could be a political constraint. For example, Ivanovo is such a case. They had struggle, and then people wanted to go to other places, but they were stuck in their location because of this political issue or political constraint that they had. Or, for example, African cities, before the independence, they had a restriction in the places that they were able to go. So many people, if they don't have this pass, they were not able to enter into the city before the independence. So after the independence, the slum grew exponentially because the moment of the independence, they freed the accessibility, they free up the boundary, and then any Africans, they were able to come to the city center from the suburban area. So the first constraint that you can imagine is this political constraint. The other one is a social constraint. A good example is like a gated community. So in a gated community, you have a restriction in the accessibility. Not everyone can enter there. The other one is a geographical constraint, which, for example, if you have a really steep mountain or if you have a river, it's not so easy to access there. So these are some of the examples of constraints that restrict in the accessibility. The second one is about occupation. So it is about how to occupy an empty space within the frame. So let's say you manage to access into the frame. However, within the frame, there are no space left over. Then of course you can enter, but then you cannot occupy the space. So this flowchart is showing this occupancy. And then if there are all the spaces that are being occupied and there are no space anymore, the first choice is you exit from the frame to find another location. Or you have another choice to actually make things vertically. So you expand vertically and then also you start to fill up the spaces. So what is happening for example, in the slum area is that actually they manage to access into the frame, but it doesn't mean there is space for them to be able to occupy. However, what happens in the slum area, in the informal settlement, they are actually occupying the spaces that are in between that are not actually formalized. So this is one thing that you can do, which is, of course, this is not a formal gesture. However, informally, what people are doing is that they are filling the gaps informally. So first thing that you can think of is that after the fact that you don't find an empty space, you can do a horizontal expansion, but then you have the vertical expansion. And then after this, you can have this filling the void spaces. So from this onwards, it's more related to this informal settlements. And then the other thing is, of course, you pixelize the spaces. So you have a certain frame, or within the frame, you have a certain space. But those spaces are all occupied. And then you start to subdivide the area. So to fill in more people there. So as a result of this, what happens in reality is this, which is the Kowloon Walled City. And Kowloon Walled City from Hong Kong is all these things that I explained just now. So first they entered, it wasn't occupied so much at that moment at the beginning. they expanded horizontally, and then the next step they expanded vertically until the point which is restricted because there was a airport there, so you cannot go beyond a certain point. So it fill in the vertically until a maximum point, and then after this they started to fill in the spaces, as much gaps in between as possible. And then after this, what happened is that they would actually subdivide the space. And moreover, for the case of Kolong, there is something that is called the cage. The cage is actually something that is an extruded space. It's like a balcony. Basically, it's a balcony, but it's an expanded space so that they can actually even increase. They can increase the interior space as much as possible. So that was what was happening in the Kolong Wall City. Next, I will move to the resources. This is a very important component inside the flowchart. So resources, it can be something like water, food, electricity that you need as a basis for living. And but resources, it can also mean work. So all of these things, I call it resource. And then in terms of this, let's say, water, food, electricity, life resources, it could be something that is obtainable naturally. So it's a natural resource that you can obtain it naturally, and legally or illegally. So what do I mean by legally or illegally? It means, first of all, these resources sometimes can be obtainable through the natural environment. So you might have well, and then you can extract water from there, or you have a river, and then you can also obtain water from there. However, in the city areas, it doesn't happen like this. So you pay for electricity, you pay for water. So this is what I mean when you pay. If there is a gesture of payment, then you are you are obtaining the natural resources legally. However, there is another way to do this, which is illegally obtaining the resources, which is of course not allowed, but it also happens. So in the case of Kolong Wall City, what was going on was that they were tapping the electricity in the neighborhood. So this is illegally obtaining the resources. So these things actually happen, and so a lot of these things were done quite illegally, and then this is why Kolong Wall City was causing a lot of problems. So another important one is of course work. If you don't have work, then of course you cannot purchase any of these things legally. And then some people, even though their living environment might be really quite painful, they prefer to stay within that frame because this is the only place that they can actually have the job opportunity. So in many of the industrial cities, people will prefer to stay in that frame. Perhaps it might be quite polluted and it might be not very healthy place to live. However, they prefer to stay there because they can find work. Another thing is that when things are done either legally or illegally, there is and then you have a community. These resources are usually managed formally or informally. So in the case of Kolong Wall City, you had the gangsters who are managing all the resources, and this I will explain it later on in detail. So this lack of resource actually cause a lot of issue, which makes people to decide that they might like to exit from this frame. So the resource, it doesn't mean it's only about whether you have the resource itself or not. However, if the management has not been done properly, then it can also create a conflict between the community, and then therefore it incentivizes people to actually exit from the frame. So this leads to the population decline. Next is about impact. So within the frame, you have the resources, and then there's life going on, and there are people inhabiting the spaces. So this have maybe some positive and negative effect. So the flow C, which is about the impact flow, is talking about this positive side and the negative side of people living together in a certain area. So the positive effect can be about you can have a sense of sharing, so you are creating a community. So this is also one social, very important social positive effect. The other one is maybe in terms of financial city. For example, I mentioned about the scale of economy. So it means there's more business opportunities, and more rich the city will be, the more wage per person can increase. So this also creates some kind of attractiveness of maybe people wanting to stay in that area. Negative effect that you can think of is perhaps because of too many people living there. You can have a pollution, or you can have other ecological impacts. For example, you may not have enough greenery, or you may not have enough sunlight. So when the cities are being built so densely, out of your window, you might see directly some other people's window. So because of this, of course, you don't see any view. You don't have any view, and then therefore you also don't have any greenery. You don't see the environment, and then also it relates to the fact that there is no sunlight. So all of this is also causing a lot of problem in terms of health. And the other negative effect could be like lack or less of resource. So because of the population increase, you might have less of these resources to share with the people, or it relates to less utility. So this relates to what I have mentioned in terms of the Henderson city size. So it means that if you might have the wage in terms of increase in the wage. However, your price index, which is relates to your living costs, it also go up. And then because of so many people living in the same area, then maybe your living area, it could be very far away from your workplace. So then the travel distance becomes so far, and then it increases this travel distance. So there are positive and negative effects in this frame of living together. And so these negative effects actually can also cause a lot of these environmental problems. However, these ones, sometimes it can be solved through technology. So you introduce a mechanical ventilation system, etc., something like this. Or you have the idea to control the number of population. So this relates to like compact city. Also, Garden City by Ebenezer Howard has this concept of controlling the population size. So this relates to the compact city, where you are able to control the right number of people in the right area. Or the worst scenario is that you leave the situation as it is. So this means that people need to tolerate from that. So in the case of slum, it's something like this. It's not the ideal situation that they want to live, or it's not the ideal environment that they want to live in. They want to live, however, they have no choice, and then therefore people tolerate. And then the most important thing here that I want to mention is that all of these things is actually related to policy. So many of these things can actually, from policy making, it can really improve the situation. But this also depends on the capacity of the nation, or the capacity of the community itself. So here what is showing in the flow charts, which has been highlighted here. So the solved problem is related to what I have just mentioned now. So if you want to really solve the issue, then there are many ways to do this. Maybe from technique, or you can also do by controlling, or you can make some policy to improve the situation. Last one is easy. So when you go through this D flow, it means that you exit from the frame. Now I'm going to present two case studies. One is from Japan. It's called Gunkanjima. The other one is Kowloon Wall City. So both of them, there are no one living anymore. So I only can show you through some historical evidences. So Gunkanjima is, in other words, in a proper name, it is called Hashima Island. The island was populated from 1887 until 1974. It's known for its coal mines and their operation during the industrialization of Japan. So this is a map to show the location. This is the entire Japan. And then here, there is this little, here is the zoom of this. And then it is called Nagasaki area. And then there is a small island here. It is called the Hashima Island. And then this is the Gunkanjima that I'm talking about. So Gunkanjima, there is a reason why it is called a different name from Hashima Island. And I would like to show you the photo. This is when I visited. You take the ship and then you will see this kind of view of the island. So this is a side view. And this is the other side. So from this view, you can understand it looks like a battleship. So Gunkanjima, it literally means it's a battleship island. And imagine this during the nighttime. All these things are very dark, and then you have the sea. You have these lights that has been lit from the residential area. These are the apartments. So you can really imagine that during the nighttime, it really looks like a battleship. So this is why the nickname of this island is called the Gunkanjima. Briefly, I will introduce the history of these islands. Mitsubishi bought the island in 1890 and began the project. And then the aim of this was to extract coal from undersea mines. And this diagram here, it is showing how the island has expanded. So initially, it started from a very, very small island, which is only shown in this white area here. And then it started to expand until the things that you see today. This is to show how they have slowly started to build the buildings in this island. So this is the view of the coal mine. As I said, this was a coal mine industry, and then therefore this building here is showing the industrial area, whereby people will walk around here, and then there is a bathing area and so on. From here they will go down, and then this is where the mine is. Currently, you see a lot of greenery, but before there were no greenery, and it was just a huge mass of concrete. And the coal mine industry is quite dangerous, and then therefore the people who are working there, they had a good salary. So another character of this Gunkanjima is apparently many people who were living there, they had their family also living in the island, and then they had a relatively wealthy life with TVs, refrigerators, and a washing machine, which are three things that changed our lifestyle drastically. And all the people who were living here, they had the money to buy all of these things. So that was also one of the aspects that attracted people to live in this island. And then therefore this is why the population increased also drastically. So they started to build a lot of residential building, high-rise residential building in this island because of lack of land. And then so therefore they preferred to go high-rise. okay, maybe for us it's not so high rise when you see 9 stories, but in the 1960s, 9-story high was the tallest. So the population density in 1960s, it actually increased a lot. The net population density here is around 1,400 person per hectare. This is the 9-story building that I just mentioned. This image here is showing one of the highest point in the island, and then currently you don't see so much of what was there in terms of the detail, and you see some greenery there. But in fact, at that moment, as I mentioned, there were no greenery. Only the greenery came about because it was being abandoned, and at the moment when people were living there were no greenery, but people were seeking for this nature and greenery, green spaces. So before it was painted green, literally it was painted green in order for them to actually appreciate. And then also they started to do a rooftop garden. They started to do a small little farming on top of the roof. And so there was almost a lot of the activities that you can find in our daily life can also be found here. So because all the family are also living in this island together with the father, who are the coal mine workers, a lot of them, they will have leisure facilities. In the island you will find a lot of the leisure activities, cinemas, discos, and pachinko, which is like a kind of like gambling things for Japan. And you, of course, you will have school, and then because the apartment at that moment, they didn't have the individual bathroom, individual shower, so they will have this public bath, and then people used to go there, and then they will have this kind of community activities in these different facilities that are located in the island. So from the photo, you may not be able to imagine, but at that moment when people are actually living there, it was full of activities and the island was full of life. However, in the 1960s, there was a paradigm shift from coal to petroleum, and then therefore because of this, they had to shut down this island in 1974. So if I briefly show you the evolution of population, and then also in relation to the coal mine that they were extracting, through some event that happened. So of course there was a drop in the population during the World War. And after the war, there was a post-recovery process, and then therefore the population increased in relation to the coal. And then in the 1957, around that period, there was the economic growth for Japan. And in 1964, there was the announcement of the paradigm shift from coal to petroleum. And so the population decreases drastically after this. However, you see that there is still an increase in the coal, because this was for Mitsubishi to make people to think that we are still continuing. So this is why, even though the population started to decline, they increased the number of coal mines that they were extracting. So in 1974, mine closed, and then people left the island in 3 months. I cannot show you a lot of the photos because I think there is a copyright issue, and it's a pity that I am not able to show some of the really nice images that were taken during the period that people were living here. But there is a very, very famous photo of this area, which is after the abundance of the island. And then in this photo, you will see almost a frozen life, because you will see this TV and refrigerators and machines and all these kind of things that they have been left, and as though only the people has disappeared from the island. And how come this happened is because of this period. They only had 3 months to leave the island, and then, as I mentioned, they had a good salary, so it was okay for them to say, okay, I will just leave everything here, and then I will start a new life in the new place that they will go. So the Hashima Island is a good record in terms of understanding what was happening there, because many things were left frozen, and then we are able to document what was the life in this area at that moment. So in terms of understanding, the critical point in the population decline is of course this point, which is talking about the lack of a resource. So in this case, there was a paradigm shift from coal to petroleum, and then therefore all of a sudden they shut down the mine, and then therefore all the people who were employed there, they had to leave the island because of loss in the resource. The second example that I'm going to introduce is about Kowloon Wall City in Hong Kong. So this is a photo that is, here is the Kowloon Wall City, which is not in the maximum stage. And then it grew until a point that was filled up completely. The middle point here is left blank because there is a shrine, or because there is a temple below here. Very, very briefly, I will just explain about what happened to this area, and then how come this specific spot was so densified. So it relates to the history of different territory that has been taken. So the red ones is when the period of Chinese territory, and then the blue ones is about the period of the British territory. So it went it went from one to another until it reached to a moment that it became a lawless area. So no one actually knew what was really going on in this area, which is exactly the point of the Kowloon Wall City. So the people who wanted to migrate to this area, they were not able to occupy the space in terms of the rest of the area. But here, because there is no law, this was the only spot that they can actually come and then be able to access and then be able to inhabit the space. So this diagram shows the evolution of expansion. So you can see as time goes by, it's expanding horizontally, and then after the moment that it's been filled up with the space, it goes growing vertically, and then after that, it will also expand in terms of the cage. Using the cage, it will expand even more, and then also at the same time, they will start to pixelize the space. So in terms of the management, I would like to introduce this diagram that is showing the section of the city, and then how kind of mess in terms of the electricity and the water piping there were. However, there was the gangster who was actually controlling the area, and then you will be setting a specific time period for you to be able to tap onto the water pipe, and then you are able to get this water. So in terms of, let's say, management, it was well organized because there was the gangster who was controlling the space and then the resources. And also in terms of electricity, it was done in the same manner. And then again, in terms of the safety, there were this rotation of community who were actually looking over fire during the evening period. So here, the dangerous thing, or the kind of like the danger that they have is the fire. So what happens if they cause a fire? And therefore, during the night time, there were some people watching around to see the spaces, so that there's no fire there. And so all of these things, they were managed and organized by the gangsters. This diagram shows the population growth in Kowloon Walled City. Actually, in fact, it's very, very difficult to find a definitive number. So I had to look into different references and somehow take roughly the average from that. So the peak point you can see is around 50,000 in total. And so it was extremely dense, of course, at that moment. And Kowloon Walled City was destroyed in 1993 when the government came to force and evicted the people. So even though they were having this really, let's say, organized spaces, they were managing the space, they were managing the community, and then the population was increasing. However, how come all of a sudden it declined with the force from the government? Because in fact, in terms of history, the governments tried to destroy this Kowloon Walled City many times, but they were never successful. But this only at this point in 1993, the government was able to actually to enter into the community and destroy from the inside. How come this event occurred is, in my opinion, it relates to this management. So as I mentioned, all the resources, they were managed and organized by the gangsters. But when the population grew too much, and then they were lacking a lot of the water pipes, or the well was drying up, and then people started to complain because even though they were being managed by the gangsters, they were not able to obtain the amount of resources that they need to live. And so the residents there, they started to kind of complain to the gangsters, and then they created an internal conflict. And so in a way, the community broke into pieces, and then this is the moment that the government entered, and then they actually destroyed the building. So I think in a way, to make the social sustainability, you really need to understand how these things are being operated and managed. And then with that, even though you might have this really hyper dense or like extremely dense condition, that for us it's very difficult to imagine the life there, but somehow it was able to actually sustain themselves because of the key point here is the management. The management was somehow successful in Kowloon Walled City, and so therefore it lasted very long. And then therefore, even though the government wanted to destroy many times, they were not able to do that. And only the moment that the community started to break into pieces was the moment that it was actually being destroyed also physically. So from this flow chart, I think you are able to understand that in terms of understanding sustainability in a society, it requires a little bit of understanding beyond just the ecological environment, which is actually to balance with the carrying capacity. However, even though if you have that capacity being fulfilled, but if you don't have a social system that is not sustainable, then your community actually can break into pieces. So this flow chart is for you to be able to understand the complexity of how a social sustainability operates. Lastly, I would like to conclude this chapter with this diagram. So in many times I have been mentioning the relationship between population and the utility. So the density, which is not the typical density, but the density that I would like to explain about is the relationship between the population and the utility. And so in fact, I would like to spot different kind of city types that we hear many times, but we don't actually know what is the definition of it. So the first one is actually the difference between village and the city. the village, in my opinion, is a condition whereby you are producing and consuming in proportion to the population. So you are not over producing or you are not over consuming the resource that you have, and it's proportional. So it's one to one kind of condition. But the city is different. It aims to have an exponential growth, whereby the more the people you have, the more wealth that you can gain. So this is the threshold between a village and a compact city, I would say. And then it will have this position whereby it might go beyond the capacity of the community it has, in terms of community, also in terms of the ecology that it has. However, your utility is increasing. So maybe in terms of Kulon Walled City, in terms of, let's say, the living condition, it may not be the best. Could be something that is actually quite unhealthy. However, in terms of utility, there was life there, and then there was a lot of things that were happening there, as though it is almost very lively, more lively than our usual life. So, in fact, perhaps the quality in terms of the utility level of the Kulon Walled City, it could be considered as something that was quite high. And the high density situation is that you don't have that kind of quality of the hyperness like the Kulon Walled City. However, it's just that you have a lot of people, and then in terms of relationship between the ecology, it's kind of like in the critical point. So the other one, which is the overpopulated city, is when the system is actually not functioning properly, but the population is just growing and growing, and then therefore your utility level will go down. Okay? So when it hits a moment that, okay, the utility is intolerable, then you will face the shrinking city like Detroit.